Browning M250 caliber machine gun, baptized Deuce by men who both feared and worshipped it, arrived at the center of a brutal arithmetic that, more than courage or doctrine, decided life or death on Guadalcanal in November 1942. When John Moses Browning finalized the design in 1921, he had given the world what military historians still call the most successful heavy machine gun in history. A weapon that could punch through engine blocks at 500 yards, shred light armor, and hurl a half-inch projectile downrange at roughly 2,100 feet per second. A monster whose psychological weight mattered as much as its physical one. The Japanese nicknamed it the woodpecker of death for the staccato rhythm of its fire. But every technical manual hid a deadly limitation: heat. The theoretical cyclic rate of 450-600 rounds a minute was seductive on paper. In real engagements, you had maybe 90 to 120 seconds of sustained fire before the laws of thermodynamics turned your best friend into a lethal liability. Every primer strike burned about 240 grains of smokeless powder and released roughly 18,000 foot-pounds of energy. Most of that drove the bullet, but roughly 30%, about 5,400 foot-pounds per round, was converted into heat the barrel had to absorb. 100 rounds dumped some 540,000 foot-pounds of thermal energy into a 26-pound steel tube. 2 minutes of continuous fire pushed barrel temperatures past 800 degrees. 3 minutes flirted with 100 degrees, and by roughly 200 degrees, the barrel steel began to lose structural integrity in ways that could be instantaneous and catastrophic. The Ordnance Department knew it and printed warnings in bold. Sustained fire beyond 2 minutes would result in barrel failure. The spectrum of consequences ranged from ruined accuracy, bullets, keyholing and tracers spiraling as rifling, lost its grip, to expansion of headspace that could cause case ruptures and vent, superheated gas and brass fragments back through the receiver, to the horror of a cook-off where chamber heat ignited a round without a firing pin and set off a runaway sequence that turned a controlled weapon into an automatic executioner until the belt ran out. Standard doctrine addressed this: spare barrels, trained crews, swap every 90 seconds, let the hot barrel cool for 20 minutes, and you could in theory sustain fire indefinitely. Barrel changes should take 30 to 45 seconds when crews were slick. And the Army even issued asbestos gloves, rarely used because they were clumsy. But all that presupposed you had the luxury to stop shooting. Guadalcanal exposed that assumption as a lethal fantasy. By November 1942, the struggle for Henderson Field had become the hinge of the Pacific. Hold the strip, and you controlled the sky. Lose it, and the campaign collapsed. The 1st Marine Division had been fighting for months, casualties outpacing reinforcements, defensive lines stretched thin. Intelligence in the dead of night warned of a major Japanese offensive, and the warning badly underestimated scale. Imperial General Headquarters committed the fresh 38th Infantry Division, with orders to break through at any cost. Corporal Tony Stein, a 23-year-old machinist, turned Marine who'd grown up in Dayton, Ohio, learned metal and tolerances working at the National Cash Register Company, and had fired thousands of rounds through M2s, manned an M2 on Hill 132, Henderson Ridge, a textbook kill zone, an 80-yard deep draw about 40 yards wide, where vegetation thinned and attackers would funnel into a deadly crossfire. Stein's 3-man crew, Morrison and PFC Jack Chen, were the only immediate barrier on that flank. When the Japanese attack began just after 02:30 hours on November 13th, no artillery prep, just shapes in the dark. Highly disciplined troops with bangalores and scaling ladders and combat experience in Manchuria and China. Morrison spotted at least 200, maybe 250 attackers massing, and Doctrine's safe recipe of 5 to 7 round bursts would not stop a human wave assault designed to keep coming regardless of casualties. Math, not bravado, drove Stein's decision. If he followed standard controlled bursts, he would allow enough survivors to cross the kill zone and roll up the line. If he fired continuously, he risked cooking the barrel and possibly killing his own crew or rendering the gun useless at the worst possible moment. He had 3 barrels and, by doctrine, enough ammo to sustain roughly 6 minutes of actual firing time spread across the engagement. But engineers at Colt and Ordnance built those barrels from SAE 4150 chromium molybdenum steel, gun-drilled, rifled, heat-treated to Rockwell C2832, a material that tolerated thermal cycling until it didn't. At 600 degrees, the steel retained about 90% of its room temperature strength. At 900 Herdreiters, about 70%, while at roughly 1200 Dradisteinren, strength plunged toward 40%. The metal could look whole, while hiding microscopic degradation that in combat could present as spiraling tracers, widening shot groups, or sudden structural failure. Stein understood machines and heat the way most of his comrades understood bullets and foot patrols. He'd seen what heat did to tolerances in an Ohio machine shop, and he ran the numbers in seconds. The Japanese in broken terrain would cross his 80-yard kill zone in roughly 120 seconds. They were massing in successive waves, spaced about 20 yards apart. To neutralize a conservative estimate of 125 men coming through his sector, assuming 4 to 5 rounds per casualty and accounting for misses and suppression, he needed somewhere between 800–1,000 rounds, not the 400–500 that idealized math would suggest, which translated into at least 2 minutes of sustained fire, and realistically closer to 5 minutes of engagement time with bursts, traverses, and re-engagements. His 3 barrels gave him maybe 6 minutes of firing time spread over 30 minutes, so doctrine said he was borderline but likely short by 2 to 4 minutes when the fight got worse. He made his decision in about 5 seconds. What followed violated manuals, regulations, and the moral comfort of neat procedures. Stein improvised evaporative cooling. He turned to the physics machinists used every day. When liquid turns to vapor, it carries away massive latent heat, and applied it to the problem at hand. Water would have been ideal, but water was precious on Guadalcanal, and soldiers didn't haul canteens forward just to cool barrels. What Stein and his crew had within arm's reach was urine, roughly 95% water with salts and organic solutes that, from a heat transfer perspective, functioned nearly as well as pure water. Regulations, TM 9-4513, and assorted ordnance manuals explicitly forbade cooling barrels with seawater, alcohol, petroleum, or bodily fluids. The JAGs and ordnance types had good reasons: corrosion, residue, hazardous gases, optics, and the reality that poor improvisations sometimes worsened battlefield effects. Stein didn't care about optics. He cared about physics, and the men who would die if the gun went silent. The first bursts at 0237 cut through the lead wave. Stein ran controlled patterns while his mind tracked time and temperature, until at roughly 92 seconds the tracers began to skew, and the barrel radiated heat through his position. "Barrel!" he shouted. Morrison executed a practiced 12-second barrel change. Chen gripped an empty ammo can, and as Stein held the hot barrel horizontal, Chen poured the liquid he'd brought, urine from his canteen and whatever his crewmates could provide, over the steel. The result was immediate. Superheated metal turned the liquid to steam in a hiss like a pressure cooker. A white cloud of vapor and an ammonia tang erupted. Steam carried away massive thermal energy, and in about 8 seconds, Stein's hot barrel had cooled enough that the fresh barrel was locked back into place, and the gun was firing again with a downtime of roughly 20 seconds. They repeated the process. Fire, swap, douse, steam, back to firing. The stench was terrible. Ammonia, cordite, vaporized organics. But so was the alternative. Over a 9-minute, 40-second engagement, Stein's position fired approximately 847 rounds, rotating through 3 barrels and performing emergency cooling cycles twice per barrel in the worst moments. The gun never jammed, never catastrophically failed. And when the dawn counted bodies, the kill zone was thick with the dead. 73 confirmed KIA attributable directly to the M2 position, and another dozen-plus probable. Lieutenant Colonel Louis Chesty Puller inspected the position at 0800, poked his finger into the last liquid in an empty can, and, in versions that vary from printer-safe to salty, expressed astonishment. Puller submitted a commendation on November 15th that moved up the chain. Stein's initiative was acknowledged, eventually generating a Bronze Star recommendation upgraded to a Silver Star by Major General Alexander Van de Grift. But the Marine Corps also quietly investigated. Ordnance and JAG officers made Stein demonstrate the procedure under test conditions, measuring muzzle velocity and barrel temperatures with thermocouples. The tests, classified at the time and filed in Ordnance Report 0421-1173, not declassified until the 1960s, found evaporative cooling dropped barrel temperatures dramatically and far faster than air cooling. A barrel that would take over 7 minutes to cool by airflow could be chilled in seconds by liquid evaporation, with measured temperature falls supporting Stein's empirical fieldwork. Chemical residues and ammonia were real problems, and multiple cycles created measurable wear. A test barrel showed roughly 3 inches of additional wear after 6 cycles. But structural failure did not follow, and the immediate tactical benefit was undeniable. The Marine Corps faced a public relations and doctrinal dilemma. You cannot publicly sanction bodily fluids as a standard operating procedure and expect Congress or the War Department to send appropriations cheerfully, and health concerns were non-trivial. Yet you cannot ignore a battlefield innovation that literally allowed a gun to keep firing through a decisive enemy assault. The institutional compromise was classic bureaucratic triage. Don't officially endorse Stein's method. Don't court-martial him. Quietly adjust doctrine where optics mattered least. More spare barrels at M2 positions, accelerated barrel change training, and doctrinal emphasis on treating the barrel as a consumable, and invest in mechanical quick-change systems. Post-Guadalcanal changes were concrete. The pre-campaign norm of 1 spare barrel shifted to a minimum of 2. Training for rapid swaps expanded from token drills to many hours of repetition. Marines practiced blindfolded barrel changes under simulated gas and fire until they could beat the clock. And later weapons designs, the M2HB improvements of 1945, the M60 in 1957, and subsequent belt-fed systems internalized quick-change barrels as a primary requirement rather than an afterthought. Cold War testing at Aberdeen and elsewhere revisited emergency cooling methods and confirmed Stein's essential lesson. Liquid cooling is fast and effective. Pre-positioned water for emergencies later became doctrinal in some theaters, and engineers pursued better metallurgy and quicker exchanges so crews wouldn't have to improvise. Tony Stein survived Guadalcanal, earned a battlefield commission at Bougainville, fought through Peleliu and Iwo Jima, and was killed by sniper fire on the 3rd day of the Okinawa landings. President Truman awarded him the Medal of Honor posthumously, the citation lauding his heroism but not the night on Henderson Ridge when physics, desperation, and available liquids kept a gun firing long enough to blunt a breakthrough. The M2 with serial number 32775 that sat in Stein's position survived the war, served again in Korea, and after an estimated 400,000 rounds was retired in 1968. It now rests at the National Museum of the Marine Corps in Quantico, with a placard that mentions valor, but not the cooling trick. History keeps both manuals and myths, The machine manuals tell you how you're supposed to fight a gun. But Guadalcanal reminds us that under pressure, men sometimes bend physics into practical solutions that wreck neat rules but win fights. Innovations that smell bad, violate regulations, and save lives. Stein's story became the sort of quiet datum that reformed training, accelerated mechanical improvements, and altered how armies think about the barrel as consumable rather than immutable. A grim lesson burned by heat into both metal and memory.